Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Manipulation Check. And we just want to thank our listeners and our viewers for continuing to watch our episodes and for providing such fantastic comments. And just remember to subscribe and also to like us. Okay, Jeff, what are we talking about today?
All right, Dan. We are going to talk about, we're going to kind of switch gears. I'm thinking about it like a gear switch. We're going to talk about we're still going to be talking about the pandemic response, but the type of content we're going to talk about is going to be, I see it as different.
Okay.
I see it as the hidden grammar of the pandemic response.
The hidden grammar of the pandemic
hidden grammar.
response.
I just said that. I just said hidden. Yeah.
Okay. So there's something going on in the background and you want to bring it into the foreground.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So it's been in the background under the surface. There's been kind of these rules, the structure that's been going on. And the hidden grammar we get the hidden grammar from what's called behavioral sciences and social psychology specifically. Typically it's the behavioral sciences, right? That's usually what gets the categorization. So we're going to bring out some of this hidden grammar. And I think we can also think of it like we're going to be very much, we're going to be also very much on brand with the manipulation check, in that we could do a very quite literal manipulation check where there's been behavioral manipulations that have been happening throughout the pandemic. We'll bring those out, show them, talk about them, and where we are, we can kind of do this retrospective, perhaps, analysis, or let's say look into, were they effective in terms of
did they work?
People? Did they work? Exactly.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to start with this article, and we expect this is going to be a multi-part series, right? Because this article's got so much in it. So we're going to talk about this article. A couple of things to point out about it. First of all, it was published in May 2020.
May 2020. So this was early on in the pandemic.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember when this whole pandemic started or not. But yeah, very early. So it was published. Okay. It's in print, typeset, everything in May 2020. So it was written, we can guess, right? How
Yeah, it must have been written just
sometime before that.
Yeah, as Corona was crawling out of the East, people were putting pen to paper. And I noticed here, so the article that you want to talk about here, Jeff, it's titled Using Social and Behavioral Sciences to Support COVID-19 Pandemic Response. And it's published in Nature Human Behavior, and it's got like 1,000 authors. The who's who of behavioral manipulation. They're all on there.
They're 41, it was my tally. I don't know if you came up, you could fact check that.
I didn't
41
measure.
authors.
I didn't count.
Okay, so 41. May 2020, 41 authors, prestigious journal. So you think, okay, 41, it must be a really long paper, right?
Yeah.
You'd
Huge
think, right?
review.
That many authors. Under 10 pages. Right.
But very densely packed pages.
Yes. How many references? Did you count the references?
I think they gave us a number here.
Yeah, they are numbered. It's easy.
253.
250. Yeah. So let's do the stats again. 41 authors, 10 pages, 253 references.
Yeah.
So this is a gem of gems for what we want to talk about. So this is, I've been almost thinking about it like a playbook. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it. I don't know if that's the best way to think of it. The hidden grammar playbook. Is that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think this paper is just one of a number of papers published early on in the pandemic, which promote this application of the behavioral techniques to change people's behavior, to bring them in line with some sort of a plan or a goal, a desired response. And actually, I got a few of the other papers here, Jeff, just to let our audience know. So one that came out also very early. So this was also May 2020 in Nature Human Behavior. And it's titled, How Behavioral Science Data Helps Mitigate the COVID-19 Crisis, a single pager. Okay. Then there was the Journal of Behavioral Public Administration. And the title of that paper is Using Behavioral Science to Help Fight the Coronavirus, a Rapid Narrative Review by London colleagues. Again, this one, a recipe book. It tells you what techniques ought to be implemented to change people's behavior. And then I have just a series of papers here that focus particularly on vaccination and how to increase vaccine uptake and make vaccines be viewed more positively.
When were these written?
So here, this one is, I got one here, June 2020.
June 2020.
June 2020, very early on. This is the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, and it's titled COVID-19 Beyond Tomorrow, Planning for a COVID-19 Vaccination Program.
So that's June 2020, talking specifically about uptake of a COVID vaccine.
COVID vaccine, way before it even was on the table. And there were, at that point, no vaccines for COVID approved yet. They were just in development. Okay, there's just another quick one here. This is also JAMA. This is January 2021, so closer to the time of actual vaccine release. And it's titled Behaviorally Informed Strategies for a National COVID-19 Vaccination Promotion Program. So again, behaviorally informed, right? And the final one I have here is the New England Journal of Medicine, an article titled Beyond Politics, Promoting COVID-19 Vaccination in the United States. And that was February 18th, 2021. Okay. So again, very early on in the whole thing. And just one more quick point here, Jeff. These are effectively preemptive. Okay.
Yes.
And I think that's the point you were trying to make with by highlighting the date. And here's what these authors would say in these articles. So here's one paragraph. The U.S. needs a national strategy for promotion of COVID-19 vaccines that unites the urgency and commitment of Operation Warp Speed. Remember that? That was Trump, eh? Operation Warp Speed. With innovative behavioral science and social marketing approaches to increase COVID-19 vaccine confidence and acceptance in diverse populations. And this is the one that was January 12th. So the vaccine was just getting, I think this is January 12th, 2021. So the vaccine is just beginning to be rolled out, and they're preemptively wanting to message people in order to increase confidence and acceptance of these vaccines.
Exactly. So what we're going to talk about too is some of the techniques they use. So one of the things that's so great about this, all these articles, is they basically lay out how to do it, or what's going to be used to behaviorally manipulate, let's say, people into certain types of behaviors, whether it's social distancing behaviors, mask wearing, or vaccine uptake.
It might be worthwhile just introducing very briefly some of the philosophy that underlies some of this, and maybe the motivation. I think from my perspective, I would say that what you have here is a group of behavioral psychologists and economists, and they figured out a way to control people's behavior, and they just really, really wanted to help during the pandemic. And they were told the vaccine's going to solve it, and so we're going to figure out how to promote the vaccine, or these other interventions are going to solve things, so we're going to promote these other interventions. And then they offered their tools of behavioral change to politicians and media and health officials so that they could control societal behavior during the pandemic. And the softer version of these behavioral change tools is they're referred to as nudges. And this term comes from Thaler and Sunstein's, I think, very popular book that came out, I think, in 2008. It was titled Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness. And the basic idea is that nudges are techniques that modify the structure of the environment, and you can think of a variety of these types of modifications. You can determine what choices people have. You can change default settings on things. You can include reminders. You can communicate various things like social norms, and you change the structure of the environment in order to change behavior so that people's choices, and this is very important, are better aligned with their own interests. That's the claim.
That's the idea, yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to help.
They're going to help, and they're going to help you help yourself or help you do what you think is right for you.
Do what you should be doing.
Yeah. And so the philosophy that's underlying this, and this is a bizarre term, but it's called Libertarian paternalism. And it sounds like an oxymoron, but Cass Sunstein, he promises that it's, and assures us that it's not an oxymoron. He actually wrote a paper on that. But the basic idea is that it begins with the assumption that the world is very complex, and that the complexity of the world overwhelms our cognitive capacities to be able to make good choices. And so therefore we make errors, we make choices that are not in our own best interests. And so therefore we need help of some kind, right? And so presumably the help that nudges provide preserve our freedom to choose. So that's where the term libertarian comes in. But they also gently guide and bias our choices, and hence the term paternalism. And the idea is they're biasing our choices towards outcome that we would desire. And this concept of paternalism, I think, applies especially when you have these so-called benevolent governments who are trying to control people's choices for the greater good. And you can imagine how that could never possibly go wrong.
What's that expression about the road to hell?
It's paved with good intentions. And Jeff, this is a new book, by the way. It's called, it's called Nudge, the final edition. And it came out in 2021. So it's got COVID content in it, which is really interesting.
That's fresh.
Yeah, it's right off the presses. And well, maybe I'll just give you a quick quote and then I'll turn it over to you. So here's what they say about their philosophy of libertarian paternalism. Our goal, in short, is to help people make the choices that they would have made if they had paid full attention and possessed complete information, unlimited cognitive ability, and complete self-control. And then later on they say, libertarian paternalism is a relatively weak, soft, and non-intrusive type of paternalism because choices are not blocked, fenced off, or significantly burdened. And so there you have it. Now, of course, the paper that you want to talk about and these other ones I've mentioned, they don't stop really at the nudge technique. They move on to the full-on push, and they do suggest coercion and mandates, which aren't technically nudges. And then the question is, are they really nudging us and manipulating us into doing things that are actually in our own best interest and things that we would want to choose? And that's a whole separate question.
It may also be worth pointing out at this point, too, that there are critiques of this nudge philosophy that are out there, even in psychology. And that might be something we get into in future episodes. So it's not it's very popular, it's very predominant, but it's not, let's say, there's not necessarily, we'll say, a consensus. In
full agreement, not full agreement.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is, so there's the philosophy that you mentioned, Dan, and then there's embedded in that or coinciding with that is the view of people and how people generally are, how they're generally not able to, they're not necessarily all that rational due to the limitations and what have you. And one of the things for this, the paper we started off with is that paper actually is very clear in their starting assumptions about people and how people are. So the people are a certain way, the world's a certain way. We need these experts. We need these behavioral scientists to help guide, to help facilitate, to help improve the quality of the response that we're going to have to, let's say, something like a pandemic. So this paper, so the Van Bavel paper, it comes in the conclusion, but I just wanted to read off three, I call them starting assumptions of the paper, and maybe perhaps of this broader perspective, but they actually draw from a 1919 paper from Sauper, who was discussing what was learned from the Spanish flu pandemic. So it's this retrospective of the Spanish flu written in 1919, and this paper written in 2020, May, is going to use sort of the lessons learned or the perspective gleaned from that paper in 1919. So here are the three, I think they refer to them as lessons of the pandemic from the 1919 paper.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, people do not appreciate the risk they run. Number two, it goes against human nature for people to shut themselves up in rigid isolation as a means of protecting others. And number three, people often unconsciously act as a continuing danger to themselves and others. So that's sort of the ground rules. That's a starting position for this article, the view of people in this article. So number one, people don't understand the risks. Number two, people don't want to shut themselves up in isolation to protect others. And number three, people often unconsciously act as a continuing danger to themselves and others. So that's a very clear. So given those assumptions about people
bad.
We can. What's that?
People are bad.
People are these pesky humans, these unfortunate people. Not the best characterization of people, perhaps. Not seeing people necessarily as in the best light possible.
Yeah, but I'm really excited about this, Jeff, because I'm a behavioral psychologist. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So I've got the power to help these helpless, hopeless people. I'm very excited about it.
They don't understand.
Yeah. No, they do very bad things, and so that's why it's good that I'm around.
I'm glad you're here too.
Are you a behavioral psychologist, or because you're industrial organizational? Do you put yourself in that category?
Yeah, I believe I am. I don't know. I'm not. Yeah, I think. Is there? Okay, here's a question. Is there any area of psychology that wouldn't be considered that?
Yeah, that's true. I think you're part of it too, man.
I'm in the club.
You're part of the special group of people who knows how to help other people.
And full disclosure, this author block here, I know some of the people on it, so not necessarily well, but these are, in the broad sense, colleagues of ours in some.
Yeah,
some
that's right.
So.
That's true. That's true.
So I guess. So we're in this. Who better to talk about it? I guess is one way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So Jeff, do you agree with those fundamental assumptions about human? Should we go there?
I'm going to say I don't. No, I don't think I do. I don't think I agree with those.
I think I would say.
So this is one of the things that's so. Because I've been talking to myself in the mirror about this paper for a long time. And one of the things about it that makes it so much easier to understand are those premises.
Yes, that's right.
Because you could read so you get to those premises at the end of the paper. So you can read this paper and you're reading this paper and like they're suggesting that you do this and you do this and you do this. And you're thinking, that's questions here. And you live through the experience of it. Mm-hmm. And then you get to the end. It's like, okay, that makes a lot more sense now. So given those conditions, a lot of the suggestions and ideas make a lot more sense. So it's a starting, a lot of disagreement we've seen, or a lot of confusion people may have. They might be looking back and saying like, how does this make any sense? If you take it back far enough to the premises of where people are coming from, I think a lot of it starts to make a lot more sense. And it becomes people need sort of like a worldview issue, I think is what another way of thinking about it.
Yeah. People need external help because they've got limitations. And I think my view on it is that we certainly do have limitations. There's no doubt about that. And we certainly do make poor choices at times.
Well, maybe you do. I don't know.
At least I do. That's right. I shouldn't generalize. But the question really is how do you respond to that, right? And so the idea that you have to have these external manipulations is one response. The other response, of course, which is favored by Gert Gigerenzer, is who's another famous researcher, is to educate people. And his argument is that you can educate people to make better choices for themselves, and that way you don't have to infer what their values are, and then you have to decide on what are viable solutions, and then impose those on people, and then try to make a story how they actually fit in with their own will, their own choices, right? Which I think the nudge folks end up doing quite often. It's much more paternalism than it is libertarianism, but then there's a whole story to justify how it is libertarian, right? Or very few are truly what they would call libertarian paternalism, and then it very quickly go sideways into full bore paternalism.
Yeah, something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
That full bore paternalism. The other thing about the position we're in now, sort of looking back, sort of depending on where you are in the world, looking back, is the other aspect of it is the facts on the ground. A lot of things are based on your assumptions of people as well as the facts on the ground. And what we see is the facts on the ground change. And looking back at some of these articles, you could start to see how certain ideas around what was happening or what was going on with this, let's say, this novel virus. You look back at some of the stuff that's talked about and you're like, oh, is that misinformation now? That might be misinformation now to say that.
Yes. This is going to be, and we have to spend a whole episode on this, right? Because people have been calling certain things misinformation. Yeah. But it turns out that maybe those were accurate, and that the other things that were said as being correct information have now turned out to be misinformation. So, exactly. And there's another whole area that's actually dovetails with this nudging, which is the whole area of misinformation and how people deal with misinformation. And so there are also obviously behavioral psychologists dealing with that issue. But let's put that one to the side for a minute.
Yeah. So maybe to build on that, so we have I'll call it the three starting assumptions about people. And then there's I'll call it the facts on the ground assumptions laid out by this paper, which is that there is, so there's a health crisis, let's say, and there needs to be a health campaign to slow the spread of the virus by increasing hand washing. That's kind of a classic, right? Remember those days? Reducing face touching, wearing masks in public, and physical distancing. So those are the things that need to happen.
So they don't mention vaccines here.
They don't mention vaccines here. So remember May 2020. So
right.
We need to get people to hand wash. We need to get people to don't touch their face, to wear masks, and to distance. Those are that's what needs to happen to stop the spread of this virus.
Just to go back to that earlier paper I mentioned, that in June 2020 they're already planning for the vaccination program. So other papers are suggesting how to nudge people towards vaccination. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a few of them that you mentioned there that are very clear about approaches. Maybe we can talk about those as well. The techniques or what needs to happen to get the vaccine uptake. So those are the premises there. So given all that, what should we do? What should behavioral scientists do? How do we get people how do we be effective parents and get people to do what they need to do? And so this article outlines, it's done in a number of sections. So we're going to cover off a few of the sections today. We don't want to try and get it all in one episode. Plus there's all these other papers too, right?
Yeah.
So it starts off right out of the gate. We're talking about threat. So this kind of links in with another assumption of the paper. So, of the situation is it's serious. There is a threat out there. So SARS-CoV-2 is very serious.
It's dangerous.
Very dangerous. I'll think about like the sort of the anchoring that happens or the framing that happens in this paper is they use the historic example of the bubonic plague to lead in. So infectious diseases are serious. They're very deadly. In this particular case, it killed 25% of the European population. And now let's talk about how to respond to corona.
Now, it's very interesting that in the paper itself now, they've started with essentially a fear appeal.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. They start with the bubonic plague. And one of the things right. And then one of the things they're going to recommend, I think what you're getting to shortly, is to actually maybe use fear.
Yes.
To motivate people to act according with the recommendations.
Exactly. Given that people aren't aware of risks, given that people don't act in their best interest, all this kind of stuff, what do we do now? So one of the tools, one of the levers is emotion, specifically fear. So it's based on, there is a correspondence here that fear is an appropriate response. That fear is actually necessary and appropriate given all the premises we've laid out, right? Given the way people are and given the severity of this threat. So I'm just going to quote from the paper. I'll try and quote from the paper as much as possible because I think they do a much better job than I would, paraphrasing at this point anyways. Okay. So here we go. It's under a section called Threat. One of the central emotional responses during a pandemic is fear. Negative emotions resulting from threat can be contagious, and fear can make threats appear more imminent. Now remember, that all sounds bad, right?
Yeah.
The way it's being presented here is that that's actually good, given the way people are and given the severity of what we're dealing with. Here we go. Appealing to fear leads people to change their behavior if they feel capable of dealing with the threat, but leads to defensive reactions when they feel helpless to act. So we need to be clear, concise, give people specific things to do once they're scared. Here's where things get a little, where you start maybe like, ooh, start scratching your head a bit here. Another challenge. So this is a challenge. Another challenge is people often exhibit an optimism bias. The belief that bad things are less likely to befall oneself than others. So these pesky people with this optimism.
False belief.
We can't have any optimism. We need to have more fear. We can't have this optimism. And it goes on to say, so we must strike a balance between breaking through optimism bias. So optimism is a bias. Optimism is not accurate, given the scenario, right? So we need to break through optimism bias without inducing excessive feelings of anxiety and dread. Okay, so we want people scared, not too scared, but we can't have any optimism.
It's that right level of scared.
Just that fine-tuned
the Goldilocks fear level.
The Goldilocks fear zone. Yeah, that's what we're going for.
Okay.
So there's a recognition as well that it's contagious, threats imminent. So we want people to be aware of and pay attention to these threats. And we don't want any optimism. So does that sound familiar at all to what you've maybe experienced with respect to how things have been presented, how things have been covered, etc.?
So Jeff, I have a paper here. The journal is Health, Education, and Behavior, and the title of the paper is How Fear Appeal Approaches in COVID-19 Health Communication May Be Harming the Global Community. Okay. And what they say is the following: fear appeals, also called scare tactics,
that's about
are a commonly used strategy to motivate behavior change. So they're saying, actually, this is being done a lot. In an effort to do so, fear appeals typically use graphic images and sensationalized language to arouse fear and focus on the negative consequences of failing to adopt recommended behaviors. And listen to this, because this is some important intel here. They go on later on to say, Witt and Allen's 2000 work is the most commonly accepted evidence on fear appeals to date. They posit that behavior change can result by increasing people's perceived severity and perceived susceptibility of a health issue through heightened risk appraisal, coupled by rising their self-efficacy and response efficacy about a behavioral solution. In this model, fear is used as the trigger to increase perceived susceptibility and severity. So there's actually a model in the literature, that says that if you trigger people's fear, and then you also have to, apparently in this literature, you also have to tell people how they could solve the problem, right?
Exactly.
Which is
because then you'll create the withdrawal or the detachment.
Yeah,
paralysis.
That's right. Yeah. So just one more quick quote here. Despite their widespread use, fear appeals have been controversial. There is mounting evidence that achieving the delicate balance of perceived severity and susceptibility, with self and response efficacy is difficult to package in a singular health message. Okay. Even more, studies have documented that fear appeals or fear inciting health communication campaigns may produce unintended consequences such as denial, backlash, avoidance, defensiveness, stigmatization, depression, anxiety, increased risk behavior, and a feeling of lack of control. Yikes.
So we need other manipulations on top of it.
To fix those.
Yeah, side effects.
Those are unintended side effects.
Also known as just effects that just aren't.
Yeah, that's right.
So there's a bunch of so I want to go through another example that I don't think gets much attention. It came out similar time as the May 2020, so this is very early in the pandemic, and it actually came from the German government, and it was translated and it was mentioned in a paper by Bagus et al. I also want to read. This was from an internal document that was, I don't know if it was leaked or circulated. I don't know the specific details for how it came out, but it was kind of making the rounds around the time of early 2020 when this was happening. So specifically, it's a document and it illustrates the intentional use of fear, or the plan to use fear to provoke a response in the German population. So it's a internal paper, German Department of the Interior. Okay. So in the paper, it states, experts recommend that the government should instill fear in the German population. So this is from the Bagus et al. In order to spread fear, the paper endorsed 3 communication strategies. First, authorities should stress the breathing problems of COVID-19 because human beings have a primordial fear of death by suffocation, which can easily trigger panic. So that's a good thing to do. So we want to make people worried and scared
that they're going to suffocate.
That they're going to suffocate. So that's a lever we can pull on to get them scared. Second, the experts emphasize that fear should also be instilled in children, even though there is next to no risk in children. This is from the article. According to the report, children should be told that when they infect their parents and grandparents in turn, they could suffer a distressful death at home. This communication advice intended to invoke anxiety and feelings of guilt, targeted at children.
Yeah, like the children are going to kill their parents. If you don't stay at home, wear a mask, get the vaccine, you're going to kill your parents or your grandparents, and you'd be a terrible person.
Intentionally directed at children. The recommended message instills fear of being responsible for infecting others to who die a distressful death. You may also recall similar types of messaging that you may have seen with respect to you're going to kill other people. You're going to be responsible for the deaths of other people. That was so many examples of this we could see get carried on. This is where it started, let's say, or this is one example, like I said, from the German government early on. Third, the German government was advised to mention the possibility of unknown long-term irreversible health damage caused by SARS-CoV-2 infection and possibly of a sudden and unexpected death of people who were infected. All these communication recommendations were intended to increase fear in the population. So you get this fear of uncertainty. Even if you do get it, you could die later. You could have some horrible consequences down the line that we just don't know about because it's new, it's novel. So remember, that was from a government, recommendations that were made to a government early on in the pandemic, specifically intentionally leveraging this fear memechanism. I don't see a lot of Goldilocks in that.
I know
that document there.
That's frightening. But I just want to actually bring this back to again an earlier paper that I mentioned. So this was a paper published in Nature Human Behavior titled "How Behavioral Science Data Helps Mitigate the COVID-19 Crisis," and this again was published in May 2020. And listen to what they say in there. We also found that willingness to restrict one's everyday life to flatten the curve and lower the burden for the healthcare system was high. However, when the motivation was to protect vulnerable others, the willingness to restrict one's everyday life was even higher. Okay? This is a very important message. Communicating the social norm is a key strategy in health communication. So basically, you mentioned that they want to freak people out in that if they don't follow the recommendations, they're going to be hurting other people. Well, that was already scientifically determined and recommended in Nature Human Behavior. So this just shows you how all this works together. You've got behavioral scientists who are doing some research. They're feeding information to health officials and government bodies who then implement that information and create these policies or these messaging programs. And then, of course, media is connected as well because they're the ones promoting some of these ideas. And so you have essentially what we call the epistemic establishment, these knowledge focused institutions in our culture now walking lockstep, promoting this fear message. Very interesting.
I wonder if that's a good time. I don't know if you have them on hand, some commercials.
Yep, I can. I think I can just play them here. I'll share my screen with you.
You may have seen, so there's a couple we have here. So I think this one you have here, I think this one's from Australia.
Right, for our listeners, it says, warning, the following is a representation of severe COVID-19 illness. Some viewers may find the video distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. It shows a woman with a tube in her nose. She's distressed. She's having trouble breathing. It says COVID-19 can affect anyone. Stay home, get tested, book your vaccination.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
So what we have there is very clear, fear, panic inducing, negative affect inducing, right? So the way that's shot, the way what's being conveyed there isn't information, isn't educational. It's a direct fear. So you can almost see the parallels there with the German recommendation, the suffocation, the difficulty breathing, emphasis on those things, really getting at that primordial sense of
survival.
Of survival. Yeah, exactly.
I felt my heart rate going up when I watched that the first time.
Yeah, uncomfortable. Not comfortable.
It's very uncomfortable. Here's your other one. So this one has people sitting at dinner table, partying, having fun. And it says, you may not see the harm here, but we see it here. And it shows an ER.
Even a small social gathering can spread the deadly COVID-19 virus to someone you love. Until we all get the vaccine, stay home, save lives.
Yeah, again, somebody on a ventilator there. And it's like the contrast there. So people partying and having a great time. You might not be thinking of the virus when you're here, but you will be thinking of the virus when you're here. And then it's like somebody on a ventilator suffocating, suffering.
And then you see the healthcare worker with the deep lines from having to wear the protective equipment, just burnt out.
Yeah.
And then you see the appeal to you're going to infect others. You're going to harm other people. You doing this thing, you might be fine, but you're going to put others, at risk.
So what you're saying is that these behavioral science recommendations have actually been implemented in the context of COVID.
Right.
And
so
it's quite...
Yeah, let you be the judge, right? So we have this 2020. So when were those commercials made? We have this 2020, these 2020 papers, early days. We have these behavioral principles. And then what we could see retrospectively, we could see the direct application of these techniques, right? And you might be able to debate, okay, no, they were doing other things. But the tone and the intention of those commercials, let's say, for example, or even other ones you may have seen, very clear, very direct, very explicit. This is about creating emotion. They're emotional appeals, right?
Yeah, although they missed the Goldilocks fear zone, I think.
Right. Which may, critique, right? So they may not be, you may be recruited, Dan, to pick up on that. So you may have, if you were consulting with these advertisers, knowing what we know now, maybe say, okay, you know what, maybe pull back on maybe too intense, maybe too severe.
This would be classified as a nudge. You're not being coerced into doing something. You're being just biased into following the intervention recommendations, right?
Right.
But here's a case where the nudge was clearly went awry because it was way too fearful, right? So, and that shows you that one of the limitations of this whole nudge approach is that if you're going to actually have effective nudges, you got to do them right. And, when does government do something perfectly, accurately, and correctly? Very rarely, I might say.
Yeah. Yeah. So you may even think of, your own experience, you may think back to other types. So those are commercials. Those are very explicit, right? So there's, perhaps other ways in which the threat was communicated or fear was induced. So this was, so right here you have so this was a study. It talks about a study that was done early 2020 as well, just showcasing the sort of the negative offset in the media coverage of COVID-19. So we're blasting through the optimism, the optimism bias. Can't have any optimism. You got to emphasize the negativity. And what this study shows is that there's much more negative coverage of COVID-19 than positive. And this was done in, I think it was November 2020, I believe.
Yeah, it says here, the article was December 9th, 2020. Yeah.
Okay, so the authors found that media coverage of COVID-19 has been much more negative in the U.S. than in the international media. Interesting. They found 91% of the stories by U.S. major media outlets are negative in tone versus 54% of non-U.S. major sources and 65% for scientific journals. Media negativity is unresponsive to changing trends in the new COVID-19 cases or the political leanings of the audience. So it's kind of impervious to actual changes in what's happening, maybe with the facts on the ground. Stories of increasing COVID-19 case numbers, stories of decreasing cases by a factor of 5.5, even during periods when new cases are declining. Media coverage has been impervious to good news. So I think that's a nice example of this sort of bust through that optimism. We can't have any optimism. We have to emphasize or maintain the threat, maintain the fear. Can't have any pesky optimism in here.
Yeah. And you can imagine that actually for the media companies, this is actually serving their own interests because fear sells. So they if all your news says, oh, everything is hunky dory, nobody's going to watch. So you actually have an interest to perpetuate the fear. And that's another limitation of this nudge technique. It assumes benevolent epistemic institutions. It assumes that the media is working for your good. But of course, the media companies are just companies like any other companies. They have their own interests. They have various funders. Governments are funding them. Pharmaceutical companies that advertise in them, right?
Yep.
And they want to sell people's attention. And so to grab attention, they want to focus on fear. And so we can't assume that they're going to have this benevolent focus and have our interest primarily at heart. That's another foolhardy assumption of the whole nudge system.
Yeah, so the next section is emotion and risk perception. So this section here starts off, sounds pretty reasonable. So we need accurate perceptions of costs and benefits. That's a pretty reasonable. Who would disagree with that, right?
Yeah.
But remember the premises of this article. We're facing this plague. So what are the costs going to be and what are the benefits going to be in light of that premise? And what this section does is it actually lays out a bit more theory, and it talks about this idea of having emotional congruence. So specifically, if you're in a positive mood, you're going to seek out positive information. If you're in a negative mood, you're going to seek out negative information. So remember, if this is a severe threat, we're going to want people to be attuned to the threat. We want people to be scared. What are we going to want to have happen? We don't want to have people seeking out positive information. We don't want any optimism. We got to bust through that. We need to have people focus on the negative information. So as negative emotion, this is from the paper, as negative emotions increase, people may rely on negative information about COVID-19 more than other information to make decisions. Now you may be sitting there thinking like, okay, is that good? Is that bad? Do we want people to just look at the negative information, or do we want people to maybe have a balanced approach? No, we don't want that. We want the negativity. So the paper goes on. Negative framing captures attention, especially for people who are less mathematically skilled. So we don't want, if you don't want to have unskilled people looking at numbers and trying to decide for themselves. Bust through that with some fear, with some negative emotion. It goes on. The media usually report of COVID-19 negatively. For example, by reporting the number of people infected and those who die, as opposed to those who recover or experience only mild symptoms. This may increase negative emotion and sensitize people to otherwise neglected risks for themselves and others. Mm-hmm. Now, when I first read this, I had to read it a few times to make sure I was understanding what it was saying. So in this case specifically, sensitizing people to otherwise neglected risks for themselves and others, that's a good thing. So they want people to be attuned, hyper attuned to
negative emotion,
even neglected risks. So the more risks you can kind of draw out and bring out, the better. And I think this speaks once again to that German document we're saying there might even be unknown risks. So stuff that could happen in the future, things you might not even be aware of, they might not even talk about. So there's risks everywhere. So you better be scared, and being scared is going to help you look for those negative outcomes. And then so you get into this cycle, and that's a good thing. That's what this is saying.
Yeah. You know what's interesting, Jeff? When I was researching this topic, I came across actually a whole host of papers where they were already testing very specific messages and the effectiveness of those messages, and mostly in the context of vaccination. So I was looking at the effect of these messages on the likelihood that people would become vaccinated, would get vaccinated. Okay, so the vaccination intentions, so to speak. And maybe I'll just mention one of them here. So one paper is by Duquette. It's 2020, and it's titled, let's see here, Herd Immunity Messages Emphasizing the Safety of Others Increase Intended Uptake of a COVID-19 Vaccine in Some Groups. And the journal is COVID Economics, which must have come out very recently, I would imagine. But it was published in sort of mid-October of 2020. So again, this was before the rollout of the vaccines. And again, you see in the paper the rationale that we've been talking about, right? So here's a quote. Since coercive policies are unlikely to be effective, uptake of the COVID-19 vaccine in the U.S. may depend on finding a message that will successfully persuade the vaccine hesitant to get their shot. The survey experiment described in this paper tests 4 messages for effects on respondents' self-reported intention to vaccinate when a vaccine becomes available, end quote. So they're looking at intentions to vaccinate, and they look at 2 dimensions. They manipulate 2 dimensions of the messages. One of them is risks of contracting the virus or the safety of the vaccine. And then the other dimensions involve focusing on preventing harm to self or reducing harm to others. Okay, so risk to self, risk to others, and then safety to self, safety to others. And so just as an example, so here's the risk to self message. Quote, it is important to vaccinate against COVID-19 because it is dangerous. The virus can harm the lungs, heart, brain, and other body parts. While elderly and ill people are at extra risk, COVID-19 is potentially deadly for everyone. Your vaccination protects you from death or severe illness. Okay, so that's a lot of fear in there. And they're testing the efficacy of this message on your intentions to vaccinate.
Yep.
So just one more example here, the safety for others message. So it reads as follows. It is important to vaccinate against COVID-19 because it is contagious. When a person becomes immune, they will not spread the virus to others. Vaccination gives you immunity without illness. Your vaccination can keep other people healthy and safe, right? So that's focusing on the safety of others, but there's other ones that are focusing on the risk to others. I just don't have that one in front of me right now. So they are very carefully testing these different kinds of fear-based messages, whether you focus on safety or fear and so on, and then seeing how that's going to affect your vaccination rate. So what you're actually seeing is a multi-step process. Okay, and I want our listeners to recognize this. You have recommendations that come from behavioral psychologists. They get implemented by people in government. At the same time, behavioral psychologists are testing fine-tuned messages and other nudges and so on, and how they're going to be, how effective they're going to be, and how the population will respond to them. That information is then fed back into these recommendation papers, which then get absorbed into government and lead to further changes in policy and messaging and so on. So this is a continued, and what's kind of cool about COVID is that it's been unfolded over an extended period of time, over the span of several years. So you actually see the process working. Now, normally you'd think to yourself, this is fantastic because this just shows you how you can have data-driven policy, right? So you might think this is good. This is science driving how we respond to a pandemic. But again, the problem is that it's driving the messaging, but somebody has to make value judgments about what interventions actually should be promoted and how, right? So there are a lot of value judgments that are undergirding this whole thing. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of naive to think that all of that can be determined by science. Some of it is determined just by our ethics and our values as a society.
Mm-hmm. And also the assumption that you know everything that there is to know at that moment. So you have the solution, you know what absolutely needs to happen.
Yeah.
So anything other than that is a problem.
Yes. Yeah.
So we need to do this very specific things or set of things. We know this is the way to get through this. And related to that, what you're saying with the how it works and how it unfolds, I thought that was a really good breakdown of how it starts and then how it gets implemented and it gets tested and then gets refined, and you could really get a sense for how things kind of unfold and roll out in the population, and then how it eventually just comes to people. Is I don't think we've mentioned it yet, but there are these things, and people might be aware of these, but there are these government groups, let's say these nudge units they're often called, that exist out there. Mm-hmm. You'll see them maybe more popularized in certain areas. So in the UK, for example, they've gotten a lot of attention of late, anyways, negative attention related to some of the ideas Dan's been talking about in terms of, okay, we're going to use this fear, and Laura Dodsworth has been really good at documenting this stuff. We're going to use this fear, and maybe they went too far with fear. So there's all these sort of things that are kind of coming out of late. But one of the things that you'll see too when you start looking into these units is they exist at all kinds of levels of government. So, for example, Ontario has its own nudge unit. The federal government in Canada has its own nudge unit. So there are these units all over the place. And they go by different names, but they're active and they're out there implementing these interventions, these manipulations, as well as refining them, collecting data. And what have you.
Yeah, and these nudge units are oftentimes staffed by academics as well. Yes. So you have this close connection between academia and the research scientists and these nudge units. One example, and this is not particularly a nudge unit, but is the science table in Ontario, the COVID-19 advisory for Ontario, and they published a document titled Behavioral Science Principles for Supporting COVID-19 Vaccine Confidence and Uptake Among Ontario Healthcare Workers. And it's basically, they include this table of recommendations on how to message and how to use social norms and all sorts of things to get healthcare workers to be more likely to take the vaccine. And so this would be an example of one of these units that's considering nudge, but there are other and there are just so many, actually. Maybe we'll mention these in the next episode when we're a little bit more prepared to talk about them. Mm-hmm. But Jeff, you mentioned Laura Dodsworth. And so this is Laura Dodsworth's book. It's titled A State of Fear, How the UK Government Weaponized Fear During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And she talks a lot about nudge and nudge units. And I think the main value added in her book is that she interviewed some people that were associated with SPI-B, which is a scientific pandemic influencer group on behavior, which is the UK, a very old, maybe one of the first real governmental nudge units. And she interviews a few people, and let me just very quickly read to you what some of and they're interviewed anonymously, right? Because they don't want to be linked to these statements. But if you permit me here, I'll just read a few quotes. So here's what she writes. 2 of the SPI-B advisors who agreed to talk to me were adamant they could only be fully honest if they were anonymous to protect their reputation and future careers. I'm going to call them Spy 1 and Spy 2. I know this is not ideal, she says. And then she says, Spy 1 is high up in their professional body, and as such, I was very keen to talk to them. Like Fancourt, they also brought up the vaccine, telling me, without a vaccine, psychology is your main weapon. You have to restrict ways in which people mix and the virus can spread. Psychology has had a really good epidemic, actually. So they're saying
business has been good.
Business has been good. And again, think about this just from, okay, I'm just telling you as a behavioral psychologist that this is a great time because I can apply for grants. Everybody pays attention to, if I was to write something about how to change people's behavior about the pandemic, it gets cited, it gets published in top journals. This is a great time for me. I have a conflict of interest. I have a conflict of interest when it comes to this. Okay, people should recognize that nudgers have a conflict of interest because it means that it's good business for them. Mm-hmm. And so just like it's good business to sell fear for media, and it's good business for government to gain more control, right? Because it gives them a lot more flexibility, a lot more efficacy as governing officials. There's a lot of conflict of interest here. Okay, but here's the next one. This one is even better. Spy 2 is the other member of Spy B who could only speak to me honestly if I agreed to conceal their identity. They had a grave concern about the use of fear. In March, the government, and this is a quote here, in March, the government was very worried about compliance, and they thought people wouldn't want to be locked down. There were discussions about fear being needed to encourage compliance, and decisions were made about how to ramp up the fear. The way we have used fear is dystopian. We have a totalitarian government in respect to propaganda, but all governments engage with propaganda. The use of fear has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. End quote.
No Goldilocks, too far.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would have been fine.
Yeah, that's right. But notice the terms dystopian. They talk about propaganda.
One of the things that was interesting about those quotes as well is they want to keep this, they want to be anonymous, right? For fear of being found out and reprisals and having their careers ruined for letting the cat out of the bag, I guess.
Yes, yes.
There was a Toronto Star article, I think it was 2021, and it talks about these nudge units, keep calling them in Canada. It talks about the Ontario unit and the federal one. And one of the things that struck me reading this article is one of the sources, or multiple sources for the article, see if I can find it here. This isn't the exact word. So this was printed in the article. Its members prefer to remain low profile. So the members of these units, let's say, of these groups, a couple of them talked to me for this article, but on condition they would not be named or quoted. What's going on there?
Why are they hiding?
So it's like, okay, so there could be any number of reasons you want to keep a low profile. We can speculate, but why? I think Dodsworth even mentions this article in her book, and I think she refers to it, these people being in the shadows, which then starts to put a totally different hue on what's going on here. So you get these clandestine groups that are keeping this low profile, that are implementing this propaganda, these techniques, this dystopian leveraging of fear, and maybe perhaps going too far, getting found out. But it paints this very odd picture about what's been going on.
Yes, so it does.
When you go with the Sunstein, go over the Sunstein work and the Thaler work, it very much almost has this. You can see the paternal nature of it, right? Where it's like, okay, we want to get people to sign up for this or file this early or not delay these things. It seems like there are these sort of like mundane tasks. Like make sure you fill out your forms, or like get your taxes in on time. All things that most people agree you should do. But what we're seeing here is we're seeing fear, emphasizing threats, don't make people feel good. And we're going to be real quiet about it. We're going to be real secretive about it. Mm-hmm. Very, very strange. Very strange. So let's move on to the next section, which is called Prejudice and Discrimination. So there's a broader categorization here of sorts with this negative emotion, this threat idea. So this is specifically talking about the implications of threat, fear, negative emotion in the context of prejudice and discrimination. So what they do is they address that the experience of fear, this is what they say in the article, the experience of fear and threat has ramifications not only for how people think about themselves, but also how they feel and react to others, in particular outgroups. So we covered in-group, out-group dynamics in an earlier episode. And they go on to say, greater fear and perceived threat are associated with greater intolerance and punitive attitudes towards outgroups. Like, okay, so if you get people all worked up, get people scared, that could have downstream implications for how they treat in-groups, out-groups, us versus them. So to learn more about the in-group, out-group thing, you can go back to our earlier episode. But it says, highlighting group boundaries can undermine empathy with those who are socially distant. And it addresses the issue. Okay, so there's a possibility that when you create these, when there's pandemics and there's fear and there's threats, that you can create these hostile tensions between in-groups and out-groups. So that's one of these things to be aware of, is that they're talking about. Remember, this is May 2020. How do you deal with this? What's something you could do to maybe offset this a little bit? The idea is you want to create sort of broader categorizations, not so much micro distinctions between us and them, but we're all in one group. For example, would be one way to do it. So it goes on to say, coordinated efforts across individuals, communities, and governments to fight the spread of disease can send a strong signals of cooperation and shared values, which could facilitate reorganization of previously considered outgroups and in-groups into single community with a common destiny. This superordinate categorization is often effective when everyone's of equal status. So what does that remind you of? There it is.
We're all in this together.
Together, yeah. You may have seen that, heard that, read that multiple times, right?
You want me to play this video?
Is this the UN?
This is video? We're all in this together. Let's play it, see what it says. Again, I'll read the text portions.
The COVID-19 pandemic is a public health emergency, but it is far more. It is an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a human crisis that is fast becoming a human rights crisis.
A new UN report shows human rights are critical for response and recovery.
The message is clear. People and their rights must be front and center.
A human rights lens shows who suffers, why, and what to do.
And in all we do, let's never forget, the threat is the virus, not people.
The report calls for a proportionate response that upholds human rights. Recovery must respect human rights now and for future generations.
We are all in this together. The virus threatens everyone. Human rights uplift everyone. By respecting human rights in this time of crisis, we will build more effective and inclusive solutions for the emergency of today and the recovery for tomorrow.
The United Nations.
Nations. So you probably have seen that. I know I've seen that at any number of levels, right? You see it from the UN, you see it from other governments, you may even see it organizational, internal communications. We're in this together, we're in this together, we're in this together. And the reason for that, as outlined by this article, is to try and break down some of these groups to avoid some of these negative consequences that may result from fear, for example. So you stoke up some fear
and then you correct it.
Maybe not too much, but if you go too far, then you maybe lever it back with a manipulation on top of that.
So he was focusing on human rights in that. And and does that mean that then he's arguing against vaccine mandates?
That was I think that was much before.
Yeah. Okay. So human rights are now, they're like, that was so last year.
Right.
That was early pandemic.
So so if you want to, you can check out our other, I'll mention it again. I'm mentioning it like 4 times now. Our other episode on us versus them, where one thing you could see, particularly where we're at now, is So what happened to this? We're in this together. When you're getting this separation, you're getting this grouping, vaxxed, unvaxxed, you're getting this scapegoating. You know, you're very clearly getting a division. You're getting a very clear message of division later on. So at first it's okay, we're all in this together, but now it's okay, it's us, them, and we're all in this together. They're not. They're a problem. We need to, you know, address it accordingly. So you're getting a full view of it where we're at now. So you're still getting, I'm still seeing we're in this together messages. I'm still seeing those.
I have one but here that you sent, Jeff.
That
CBC.
we doesn't include the unvaxxed.
Right.
Yeah, this is 2020.
CBC.
Yeah.
Title is "We're All in This Together." The phrase uniting Toronto in long, lonely battle against COVID-19. And posters. We're all in this together. Posters all over the place. There you go.
So where does that come from? Right? Where did that come from? Didn't just emerge organically.
Yeah, these are these messaging campaigns that people are working on. And by the way, there is an international nudge unit. Maybe if I remember, I'll put it up here on the screen. But there are these units that consider behavioral economics approaches across all sorts of different countries and so on, and they provide a unified message. And so there is coordination even internationally when it comes to some of these things.
That reminds me of another point I want to bring up is, I don't know if you've heard about this internet thing we have, Dan, but we can get information from all over the world now on this internet.
Yes. Woo.
Which means we can get exposed to other countries' nudge units as well. So we can watch that. We did watch it already. We watched a commercial from Australia.
Yeah.
So we're not isolated with respect to the extent to which we can get exposed to nudge units.
Yeah, the propaganda knows no bounds.
It's boundless. Yeah.
Yeah, it only has bounds when, for instance, some channels of propaganda are blocked,
right,
and censored.
Right.
But otherwise,
let's say even then, things could get downloaded, uploaded on video channels like YouTube or whatever.
That's right. Yeah, Jeff, I'm just looking at the time here, so we should try to close up soon.
Okay.
Do you have any final points you want to make about fear?
So there's one last section I want to quickly run through.
Yep.
Because I think it creates a nice opportunity for what I'll call like a macro analysis of what we've covered so far.
Yes.
So the next section, or the final section in this broader categorization, is called disaster and panic.
Okay.
And this section talks about the potential implications or consequences of creating panic. And panic's a bad thing. And there's generally an association between disasters and then panic, and panic undermining the greater good. But then it kind of softens up on it, says, actually, that's not actually really true, because most people will act sort of decently in these panic situations. The evidence kind of suggests otherwise. But there is still this discussion of panic. And one of the things that talks about specifically is this issue of sort of panic buying or stockpiling, and how that can undermine.
Get your toilet paper.
So this is an example from Ontario, once again, of a poster to discourage panic buying specifically, right? So we're seeing a direct connection from this article to what we're seeing rolled out by government institutions. So there's that, but then there's also this opportunity to mention, there's an article that came out in 2020, I believe. Yeah, 2020. Was it 2020? Yes, it was 2020. It was published in the Ottawa Citizen. I thought it was going to be, maybe it got more traction than I thought it did. I thought it was going to get a lot more traction. It didn't necessarily seem to go too far, but it was called "Military Leaders Saw Pandemic as Unique Opportunity to Test Propaganda Techniques on Canadians," Forces report says. So Ottawa Citizen, unique opportunity to test propaganda. So the military testing propaganda techniques. And one of the things I want to point out with this article in relation to this issue of panic and disasters is one of the things that was cited for the rationale for doing so, the Canadian Forces rationale for doing so. And I'll read from the article itself. The plan was devised by the Canadian Joint Operations Command, also known as CJOC, relied on propaganda techniques similar to those employed during the Afghanistan war. The campaign called for shaping, quotes, and exploiting, quotes, information. CJOC claimed the information operations scheme was needed to head off civil disobedience by Canadians during the coronavirus pandemic and to bolster government messages about the pandemic. So the rationale for doing so, the rationale for propagandizing Canadian citizens, for the Canadian military propagandizing Canadian citizens, was to head off civil disobedience. So perhaps, unrest, disorder, panic, unruly behaviors as a result of the pandemic. So what you're seeing, this will be the macro analysis time, is what you're seeing is you're sort of seeing this tension now. So you got this, we got to get people scared. We got to emphasize the threat. We need fear. It can't be too much fear. We got to bust through the optimism without having too much. But also, we got to watch out for this panic.
Yes.
So you're seeing this conflicting tension between these two sides, right? So we got to get people worked up. We got to get people riled up, get them scared, but not too scared that they're going to start going ballistic.
Yeah.
So you're seeing this, perhaps, as we've kind of pointed to, you're seeing this sort of you swallow the spider to catch the fly situation where you're trying to maybe balance all these different manipulations, all these different techniques to try and optimize the public response. And you're doing it on a large scale with a lot of people. So it's quite the operation. And I think perhaps in people's experiences, they might have seen or experienced some of this stuff where you're kind of maybe seeing conflicting things. So be really scared, but we're all in this together, and don't panic but always also be prepared. So you're getting this sort of macro experience of all these manipulations happening to you, perhaps not even on a daily basis.
And I think the interventions are presented as a release valve on the pressure, which is why these messages are so effective and these techniques are so effective, because you get all freaked out and they tell you the way to get rid of your fear is just do this. This is all you have to do. And it's really three or four simple things. You get a shot.
And you can do it.
And you can do it. It's doable. You get the shot anywhere. It's easy to get. You put your mask on, you distance from people, and maybe you stay at home and wash your hands or something like that, right? So very few things. And that's why the messaging, it seems to be so consistent, right? Because the interventions themselves are the management of the fear that's being generated. In fact, that fear is being generated in order to get compliance with those various intervention techniques. So it's a very, very powerful tool. Interestingly, when I look at some of the literature and they were examining intentions to vaccinate, the messages that they tested didn't have huge effects. Like they were, sometimes they were sort of non-significant. Other times you get marginal effects. So in those experimental contexts there, but things like reminders, which are a different kind of nudge, reminders can actually have a huge effect on vaccination uptake. And that's also a type of nudge.
But it's an interesting context to think about. So in the context of a study, self-contained study, what a small effect would be on a population level. When you're talking about a small effect, how many people are we talking about then, right?
Yes, and the way that this is always construed is in the sense of layering, right? That what you're doing is you're layering intervention. So if the message is going to increase the vaccination by 2%, that's fantastic. 2%
of the population of Canada or US or wherever is a lot of people. Yeah,
and then you have this other type of message, or now you have coercive techniques, which will increase it by 10%. And so, you're going to work your way up, and next thing you know, you're going to have, 80% vaccinated or complying or whatever. And by the way, and we could talk about this in another episode, but that whole focus on always telling you the large number of people who are vaccinated and that it's continually growing is itself a recommended nudge technique in these papers, because it creates a social norm that people then seem to conform towards. So there's just
it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And these papers, and maybe we just end on this, and I can maybe splice these into this video after. These papers, they all have like boxes or images or lists of interventions. So they're giving you very concrete suggestions, and there are many of them. It's not just 3 or 2. There's like a long list. I'm thinking of box 1 here in this paper, but in the other papers, it seems to be something very similar. Yeah. And so there's many of these types of nudges, and they're all layered on top of each other. And so even though each one of them may not be, massively effective, the idea is that together they're going to create significant behavioral change in the population.
Yeah. So we're just doing the tip of the iceberg here.
Yeah.
There's so much more to talk about here. This is just one paper. This is that short paper. We've got through what? 2 pages, 1.5 pages?
Yes, that's right.
There's lots more to cover. So we get science communication, conspiracy theories, fake news. We got political polarization, culture, cooperation within groups, trust, leadership.
We've got so many episodes to do.
Social isolation, connection. Like, it goes on. Like there's...
Well... this is great because we've got lots to talk about in future episodes. So, Jeff, why don't we leave it here?
Let's do it.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Dan.